to an emir who comes to him, and he's, of course, very upset, and he challenges him to a debate. The emperor challenges him to a debate and says, "You tell me, what has Islam brought except destruction and murder and terrible things for people? You've come to our lands, you've destroyed things, you've killed people, you've oppressed people, you've destroyed our religion. Tell us what Muhammad has brought that is good." The conversation that occurs then following this, okay, is a debate that goes back and forth in which the Muslim emir says, "Well, Islam has brought all of these goods," and the emperor says, "Well, Christianity has brought all these goods," and they essentially, have this conversation. And Benedict's point was that that these kind of questions need to be debated from a rational perspective as well. Okay, that we have to engage in conversation and not simply go our own directions. The reaction to his lecture, though, was extremely negative, and people immediately turned to this as a critique of Islam. But one very positive thing has come out of it. Okay? At first, it looked like this was going to be the end of a lot of relationships that had been built since the Second Vatican Council. The Vatican has had, and most bishops' conference has throughout the world, have established dialogues with Muslims on a local level as well as on an international level. And there was great concern that all of this was going to go down the tube, so to speak. But in fact, what happened was, in a very unusual response, a group of Muslim scholars got together and wrote a document which is called the Common Word. Okay. It's the first time ever that a group of Muslims have gotten together and issued any kind of a common statement that purports to represent Muslim views. Okay. Muslims do not have a creed, they don't have a list of doctrines, they don't have anything like that, they don't have a set liturgy. Okay. But now we have this text called a Common Word, and you can find it on the internet. It's www.acommonword.org. The title, A Common Word, is taken from a verse in the Quran that says, in fact, I think I can even quote it exactly here. It's Surah 3, and it says this: "Say, O people of the book," or people of the scripture. So he's talking to Christians and Jews. "Come to a common word between us and you, worshiping only one God, not associating any partners with him, and not taking one another as lords. And if the people of the book turn away from you, then say, bear witness that we, Muslims, are the ones who have surrendered to God." Okay, so it comes from this phrase, "Come to a common word between us and you." What this document does is it lays out very carefully a number of verses, both from the Quran and from the New Testament primarily, that show that Muslims and Christians have in common the love of God and the love of neighbor. And that this is enough to build a common society on. Whatever else Muslims and Christians disagree on, that at least we can agree on this. In many ways, it's very similar, if you're familiar with the Vatican Council document Nostra Aetate, which is the text that came out of the Council that speaks specifically about non-Christian religions, how the church ought to relate to non-Christian religions. And there is a paragraph in there, paragraph 3, that is specifically directed towards Islam. And it lists a number of things that one can find some commonalities between Muslims and Christians. And this document is, for the first time, something that kind of reciprocates, that says, yes, Muslims can say that we agree on this with you. Now, like Nostra Aetate, it ends with a call to conversion. Nostra Aetate ends with, as Christians, we call you to accept Christ, and we believe in the incarnation, et cetera, et cetera. A Common Word ends with, we do not believe in the incarnation, we do not believe in the Trinity. They are explicitly rejected by the Quran, and we call on you to think about accepting Islam. Okay. So both of them they lay out what is in common, and then they both conclude with a call to conversion. What's very, very useful about this is that for the first time we have a statement that has been issued by some very notable people, and a lot of people have signed on to it. You can see that this is the internet now. You know, people all over the world have signed on to it, endorsing it, agreeing with it. And it's something that it's very orthodox from a Muslim point of view. There isn't really any reason to disagree with it. But what it has done is it's unified a lot of Muslims into a commitment to a conversation with Christians. Now, this is an extremely unexpected consequence of 9/11. That instead of having a reaction, and as many people feared, that there would be something of a religious persecution or crusade from both sides. Okay? In general, there have been very strong movements to try to reach some kind of reconciliation. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is I do want to leave enough time for questions, and I don't want to wear you out too much here. One of the things that has proved to be a little bit more sticky is the movement towards speaking of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam as Abrahamic religions. One thing that we find in the common word, and it reflects a common usage that has come about, is the term Abrahamic religions. People who have been studying religions for the last couple of centuries have come to recognize that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all belong to a particular family of religions. Okay? They have a number of things in common. They believe in one God. They believe that there is a creator that is different and separate from the creatures that this creator has created. Do not believe in reincarnation. Do not believe that there's one life that begins and ends, that there is a reward and a punishment for the deeds that we do in our life, that there is something that Christians call salvation history, meaning that God creates creation for a purpose, and that at some point everything will come to an end, and we don't know exactly when that will be, but we know that there is a purpose. Okay. And these particular religions share this. By the way, if you have not seen the Tree of Life, that's what it's about. Okay, it's basically the story of Job, the question of evil, and this beginning from creation all the way to the end. What to call this group of religions is very, very difficult. Okay, for a long time, people primarily focused on Judaism and Christianity, and we get this term Judeo-Christian. Even Providence College, in its mission statement, for a long time it said in the Judeo-Christian tradition. This is fairly common. Now, especially since 9/11, people have become more sensitive to the fact that Islam, and Islam includes 1 billion people, more than 1 billion people worldwide, probably closer to 1.2 billion people worldwide. Islam belongs to this family, sharing a lot of common beliefs. For a while, it became very popular to speak of the people of the book, okay, which is a phrase that comes out of the Quran. And that reflects certain ideas. Another aspect of this family of religions is that they all hold some idea of revelation, that God in some way communicates to human beings. But there is a limitation with this, because Jews, Christians, and Muslims all understand the way that God communicates in different ways. Jews tend to put an emphasis more on the events of history. Think of the call of Abraham, the Exodus, certain things that God has done to show God's power. Christians emphasize the incarnation. God communicates through Jesus Christ. And Muslims put an emphasis on the notion of God communicating through a scripture that is a word, that is an actual text. Okay? That text has now been written down, but that it is actual words. And so people have kind of moved away from this notion of the people of the book. So now what we find in the Common Word document is an emphasis on Abrahamic religions, that all three religions trace their origins back to the person of Abraham. Now, one of the interesting things about this is that it has raised the question of, well, what do we believe about Abraham? And I would say that right now, one of the major topics in interreligious dialogue that has come up in maybe the last 2 or 3 years is the question of what is a covenant. And ultimately, what that leads us to is, what kind of a relationship does God have with human beings? Is it, as the Quran says, a creator-creature, more master-servant? Remember, the word Islam means to submit. A Muslim is somebody who has submitted to God. Or is the relationship, as Christians usually will say, one of love? Another aspect that this leads us to is the question of what reconciliation looks like. Muslims tend to speak much more in terms of mercy. In fact, God is called the merciful at the beginning of every single surah, every chapter in the Quran. It opens with, in the name of God, the most merciful and beneficent. Okay? God is the merciful one. Because human beings, as creatures, need God's mercy. We're in no position to ask God for anything. God is the ultimate creator. Christians, on the other hand, have tended to lead more towards the emphasis on God's love, and particularly on forgiveness. Forgiveness and reconciliation require a certain degree of mutuality, which Christians believe that we can say based on the incarnation. If God truly has become human, then there is a certain amount of commonality. And this is something that is explicitly rejected in the Quran. Now, what does all this mean? Okay, in the end, all right, these are all very theological and not very practical questions. But one of the things that we're seeing is that the theological questions, and this is the direction that Pope Benedict has really been moving to in the last few years, and the Vatican in general, is that these theological questions do matter. Okay, these theological questions do matter. That depending on what our perception of God is, or whether we think God exists or not, I mean, that's a whole other problem. But if we leave God completely out of the question, what we think, how we think a community ought to be structured and organized to best promote and encourage human flourishing. What is the best kind of society? And I'll go back to 9/11. What bin Laden said was that America was the worst kind of society. His argument was that what has happened in the United States is that secularization has brought immorality, injustice, inhumanity, and that is proof that whatever this comes from, and probably Christianity is the source, is false. Now, in the 10 years since then, in interreligious dialogue and in dialogue with Muslims, we've come to agree that we have a lot more in common than bin Laden would have admitted. Okay. And in fact, the common word shows that we do have a lot in common. At the same time, we're also becoming very aware that Christians and Muslims disagree on some very fundamental points. Points that many of us think do ultimately really matter. And right now, I have to say, I'm going to kind of end on somewhat of a negative note, although I don't want to be discouraging about this. I think that we have a long road ahead of us as we try to work out how we can create a society that can accommodate both of these views. Okay. because each one brings something different. I don't want to use the Samuel Huntington's idea of the clash of civilizations, but I will say that I think he was on to something important, which is there are different ways of thinking about what the purpose of human beings is. Why are we here? And in general, right now where we are in dialogue, is that we're seeing that Christianity in general puts an emphasis on this idea of the individual vocation. That each individual person is called to a particular purpose. And that can be reflected in many, many different ways, but that society has to create an environment in which human beings can exercise that vocation. That comes with a lot of risks. The risks are that it requires a more open society. It requires a society that depends on virtue. It depends on people behaving themselves. It depends on people working for the common good. And this is very, very different from the way that Islamic society has historically, and I'll say historically, has historically functioned. Now, there are many, and I'll just mention one organization, the Center for Islam in Democracy, which is based in Washington, D.C., is a very important think tank that has been, that is made up primarily of Muslims, who are working very hard on political theory in Islam and philosophy, trying to figure out how one can come to some kind of an agreement. Okay, does one, as has historically been understood, does one have to live under Islamic law in order to completely fulfill the requirements of Islam? Many Muslims would say no today. Muslims in the United States generally say no. I do not have to live under Islamic law in order to fulfill the requirements. But many Muslims are very skeptical that an open society can really do that. So I'm going to conclude and then open it up for questions here, just by saying that I think that in some ways, the tragedy of 9/11 and for all of the horror that came out of it, the questioning that has come out of it, and the conflicts that we all know that have gone on in Iraq, in Afghanistan, the very tense situations with Iran, et cetera, et cetera. There are lots and lots of things that can be listed. In some ways, I think have precipitated a conversation certainly that no one 15 years ago would have thought would ever happen. I know when as I began with my own studies, when I began studying Islam, no one thought that we would be at this point that we are today. I think for the first time in centuries, we are having serious conversations, and that there are committed Christians and Muslims on both sides who are interested in working out a way for us to live peacefully. And as we all know, nearly half the world's population is either Christian or Muslim. And that is growing. It's growing on both sides. So this is something that we should all be concerned about, and I would highly recommend that you continue. I think it's very much underestimated the importance of these theological issues. We often tend to talk about the political issues, what the Secretary of State has said, what the President has said, what different political institutions are doing. From a Muslim perspective, these are very much theological questions. And so I think on that note, I will end, and we will open it up for, I'm happy to hear what your questions are.